I'll give you a couple minutes to eat that. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roger Norum. I am the co-director of the Eudaimonia Institute, although I was just alerted to the fact that from my colleague Ilka that Eudaimonia is actually no longer an institute, it's now a center, which is good to keep in mind. On behalf of myself and director Jouni-Matti Kukkonen, I'm very pleased to welcome everyone, to all of you here in person and all of you here online, to the Eudaimonia annual lecture. For those of you who don't know, the Eudaimonia Center is one of our university's 4 new centers for interdisciplinary research, and we focus on human sciences. Eudaimonia's central mission is to foster interdisciplinary research and cooperation, and seeks to show researchers how to actually do interdisciplinary research across fields, faculties, and focuses. Eudaimonia has a large scope here at Oulu, covering scholars across the Oulu Business School, Geography Research Unit, Faculty of Education and Psychology, and Faculty of Humanities. There's a lot that we do here. As many of you know, every 4 years, Eudaimonia funds a dozen or 2 dozen interdisciplinary research projects known as the Spearhead Projects, which look to push forth research excellence at the University of Oulu by funding multi-researcher projects with doctoral researchers and postdocs. We host monthly lectures given by these Spearhead-funded researchers, arrange morning breakfasts where you can get to know new colleagues, and are currently planning upcoming symposia on media and networking skills, tools and hacks for university work-life balance, and a semester of public debates about a range of topics, including technology and society, militarism in Finland, and the colonization of space. Eudaimonia is a very open organization, and we are very open to hearing your ideas and suggestions for initiatives, events, plans, activities. So feel free to contact myself or Jouni-Matti, or indeed coordinators Ilka Lehtimäki or Janne Kurtako for if you have any ideas for things you might like to see Eudaimonia do. The Eudaimonia annual lecture, while it may not have a genealogy of hundreds of years, it is the flagship event of Eudaimonia. Each spring we aim to find an interesting scholar to speak about an interesting topic, one that is of interest to a range of different researchers. The lecture is a way for us to bring people together, to meet each other, and to think together through a topic of interest for the humanities and social sciences, and for society at large. Today we are extremely lucky to be able to welcome here Kritika Srinivasan, whose critical scholarship lies at the intersection of political ecology, animal studies, the geography of nature, and post-development politics. While it is likely that not everyone in this room works on conservation, or indeed even the environment, Kritika's work is extremely engaged and extremely thoughtful, and having spent the past few days listening to and thinking with her words, I can tell you that you are all really in for a treat today. So we will now have Kritika speak for about an hour, after which time there will be time for questions, comments, and discussion. And then we will have some refreshments for all of you. And then Tracy Hruska, Eric Berger, and Ilka Lehtimäki will lead us through an invigorating afternoon, and maybe an evening even, of PowerPoint karaoke, which, even if you have no idea what it is, I would really encourage you to stick around for. And now, to give Kritika the introduction that she deserves, I introduce to you my lovely colleague, Pauliina Rautio, Professor of Biodiversity Education. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. I'm Pauliina. I'm very, very happy to have been able to invite Kritika here to be our keynote. Kritika's work across human and social sciences on cohabitation with other animals has inspired me and many others in its boldness and honesty. She seeks to work with modes of cohabitation that are not easy or always pleasing, including street dogs, invasive species, animals in medical use or animal agriculture. By doing this, Kritika manages to hold a mirror to our human selves, reflecting the often uncomfortable aspects that we might prefer to ignore, such as how we simultaneously realize that our current standards of living far exceed anything that is sustainable and how we are still somehow incapable of accepting less. She makes bold but insightful provocations about how we ought to live if we accept ourselves as animals among others, sharing the risks of being alive and staying alive in a more equitable way. This would include, for example, accepting shorter lifespans, accepting illness as part of life, and accepting more death even, more human death. This sounds both radical and sensible at the same time. Most Finnish people my age remember an outspoken environmentalist, fisher, and author, Pentti Linkola. He was known for his very extreme views on how to save our planet from destruction caused by overpopulation and high standards of living. His views included acceptance of all kinds of disasters, even such as war and terrorism, because these were events to him that would directly reduce the human population. He called out Finnish people, thinking ourselves as somehow close to nature, and pointed out that almost nowhere else in the world in a similar climate zone are there as many people living in big heated houses, most of us owning 2 houses. And indeed, the Finnish overshoot day, or the date when we have used our share of resources, is in early April, so it's gone already, whereas the global one is in August. But let's really push it. In a country proud of achieving the lowest infant mortality rate in the world, a core measure of health and well-being, could we or should we accept less? If we knew that lowering standards would increase overall health and well-being of the planet in a more equitable way for more humans, but also beyond only us humans. Kritika's work asks us to consider our limits and to learn to stay in the controversial and uncomfortable zones without immediate defensive reactions, but exploring possibilities or impossibilities to live otherwise. At the very least, to entertain the thought. Thank you so much for coming over, Kritika. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you, Roger. And you set expectations to be really high, and I would ask all of you to take half a moment to bring them back down. Am I audible? Is that okay? All right. So I know that this is supposed to be a lecture, but I would prefer us to treat it like a conversation, the Eudaimonia conversation, if that's a possibility. I do have notes, and slides, as you can see, and I'll be drawing on them. But as we go on, you'll realize that what I would like the session to be about, the next hour to be about, is more about us having a back and forth about some of the questions that I want us to think through together in this, in the next 60 minutes or so. So that's basically what I would like us to do. So be prepared for that. Okay, so I want to start by. With 2 little stories. So the first is something that happened in 2023 in the month of June, when the Tamil Nadu Forest Department captured from the Periyar Tiger Reserve, which is a protected area, a 40-year-old elephant called Arikomban. They picked him up from there and they transported him to a tiger reserve in Tirunelveli, which is in a region nearly 300 kilometers away. Now, this was the second time in 1 month that Arikomban had been subjected to relocation, and each time he'd suffered significant distress, injuries, stress, everything. Now, the first time Arikomban was relocated from his home in Chinnakanal, he immediately started making his way back to to Idukki district, which is where he came from, which has always been home to elephants. Now, why was he caught and relocated? Because in recent years, he'd started getting rice and sugar from the local shops and fields and kitchens. Now, everywhere Arikomban was relocated, there were protests from the communities there asking for him to be removed. The only exception was a tribal community in his home district in Chinnakanal, who asked for him to be brought back, saying that he belonged there. He wasn't taken back there, but they were the only exception to the kind of the protests that were there wherever he was taken. So that's Arikomban's story. Now, a year before that, in 2022, 20 African cheetahs from South Africa and Namibia were transported to Kuno National Park in Madhya Pradesh. Now, in the couple of years that have passed since then, 8 of them have died of relocation-linked trauma, including maggot wounds caused by radio collars. More than 30% of the cubs that were born there have also died, including 2 that were found mutilated in their mother's den. Less than half have been released into free-ranging conditions, as in, for them to be wild. And those that have been, many of them have been quickly brought back to the soft-release boma because of some problem or the other, usually a health issue. The ones that remain outside often end up in situations such as what happened about a month ago.
Madhya Pradesh now, where in Shirpur district, a Namibian cheetah, Jwala, and her 4 cubs were pelted with stones by villagers while hunting a cattle calf. In fact, the family had strayed near the Shirpur-Gwalior railway line when they caught hold of a calf. A viral video shows the villagers using stones and sticks to drive away the cheetahs and forcing them to abandon their hunt and also retreat to Kuno National Park. Kuno's tracking team swiftly intervened, preventing further harm and ensuring the safety of the cheetahs. And officials now confirm that Jwala and her cubs are healthy. Jwala, in fact, is among the African cheetahs introduced in India and released into Kuno, marking a significant step in India's cheetah reintroduction project.
Okay. Now, Arikumbans and Jwala stories are fairly common. Even though they're set in India, these are stories that you will hear from different parts of the world. They're all part and parcel of wildlife or biodiversity conservation efforts across the globe. So what I would like us to do now is to take kind of a step back from any of these initiatives or programs or activities or even these stories, to think about what is this thing called conservation. Any thoughts? What does conservation mean to you? And by conservation, I'm talking about conservation in the context of wildlife or biodiversity, not architectural conservation or heritage conservation. You're looking at me, so you can go.
Preventing extinction or population to go down to a critical threshold.
Okay, preventing extinction. Anything else? Or below a certain threshold. Yeah. Off. Non-sustainability in which, like, if you drive population to the number of 1, then it will. Okay, so a threshold of numbers of something. Yeah. Okay.
Is it possible that it's also about balancing between different species?
Okay, balancing between different species. Okay. Anything else?
About preserving and keeping things the same, about maybe keeping a past that never was.
Conserving and keeping things the same, a past that was. And I would like us to keep that there, bear that in mind, because I'll come back to that in a bit.
Can be conserving habitats as a whole and the ecosystem, not just species and numbers.
Yeah. So together, all of you have kind of have started arriving at how conservation is usually understood in conservation science and in practice, which is that of any set of actions that directly enhance the possibility for habitats and ecosystems and species to persist in the wild. So that is the kind of the most general definition of conservation. And within that, you have a whole range of activities aimed at different things, whether it's keeping balance or preventing extinction or preserving things as they are. Okay. Now, if we take this definition, there's this word there that I would like us to think about, which is that of the wild. What do we mean by the wild? Yes?
Untouched by humans.
Okay, untouched by humans. Is there anything that remains untouched by humans?
Very little.
Okay, so does that mean that there's no wild left in the world?
I disagree. There's parts of the seafloor that are wild.
Microplastics?
Sorry?
Do microplastics go there? I don't know. They don't? Okay, there are parts of the seafloor that remain untouched by human activity. Okay. Is there anything else that might be wild? Or are there different understandings of the wild? I mean, these are all terms that we take for granted, which is why I would like us to spend some time thinking about them. Yes, you. Yeah. Unmanaged, okay. That which eludes human control, okay.
Actually, it's often used in comparison to something less wild, so it's always in comparison with wilder, but I personally in conservation don't use wild because it doesn't hold well as a concept.
Okay, yes.
But it also only works if there is something which is civilized, which means there is already a distinction drawn that, for example, anything which is human is not nature and not wild.
Okay, so if you think about the planet today, apart from those corners of the seafloor that you were talking about, you find that most of the planet is, you can't say that it's not touched by human activity. So the initial sort of understandings of the wild as something that is separate to civilization or to society, whether it's spatially or in other ways, doesn't really work in the world today. But does it mean that there is no wild? Or is there still a way of, what is it that all of these conservationists are working towards? When you think about the different sorts of activities, including the examples that we looked at before, whether it's the elephants or the cheetah reintroduction, what they're trying to do is to get certain organisms to live in a condition that is independent, right? So they're working towards getting to a situation where they can, what I like to think of as live freely, or getting them to live as free living animals. So in today's world, where you really can't think of any space that is untouched by human activity, which is wilderness. There was a discussion about wilderness yesterday, I think, in the workshop. Is that person here? Was it you? Yeah. So we can't. So even if conservation might have started off having an understanding of the wild as being the wilderness, as something where there's no human presence or activity, over the years we are now in times where you can't really think about the wilderness anywhere. So even in the most protected of national parks, you will find human activity. For example, conservation activity is also human activity, right? Whether it's in the context of going there to manage certain animal populations, and in many parts of the world, even in national parks, like in India, for example, the forest departments are now having to go and provide food because there isn't enough food that is available because of wider climatic change for the animals that live there. So there's nothing that remains untouched for the most part by humans. So therefore, the only kind of understanding of wild that we can work with is that of free living, is what I would like us to bear in mind. Of course, we can argue about that. Okay, so we answered this question of what conservation is. I would next like us to think about, what is conservation oriented towards, right? The ontologies of conservation, and that the answer to that was already there in the definition, which is conservation is about enabling species and habitats to persist in the wild. So conservation is interested in the protection of nature, but it's only interested in the protection of collective ontologies of nature, whether they be populations or ecosystems or collectives or species, right? Which is where this question of the threshold comes into the picture, because you don't want the numbers of the collective to go beyond a certain point. And within these collective categories, there are only some organisms that are the subject matter or the target of conservation efforts, and that's those that are endangered. So conservation is only focused on those organisms or ecosystems or landscapes that are considered to be endangered. So there are kind of, so conservation, as it's practiced and as it's conceptualized in today's world, is not just about the protection of nature, but it's about the protection of certain categories of nature and about the protection of nature that is considered to be endangered. How do we go around protecting nature through conservation? These are some different tools and activities that you will find in conservation efforts across the world, and and some of which can be found in the Arikomban and Jwala cases as well. Now, humans have always lived, ever since human existence, we've always lived alongside other animals and plants. What then drives the need for conservation in today's world, right? So from the time we came onto the planet, there have been other animals and plants. We've always cohabited, right? And that is something that if any conservation social scientist or a political ecologist would tell you. Now, part of the answer to this question of why lies in where the current biodiversity hotspots exist. Now, as you can see, barring from some areas in the US and Australasia, they're pretty much located in what would be considered less developed parts of the world. And this is not just because of biogeographical or climatic reasons. As this paper shows, if there is not much by way of wild or free-living plants and animals in wealthier countries, it is because they were destroyed first during the agricultural and industrial revolutions. So for instance, if the UK doesn't have wolves today, it is because they were exterminated because of both habitat loss and systematic bounty hunting, because they were considered to be a threat to livestock and human life. So England or the UK lost most of its biodiversity before monitoring started. So, which is why when you say biodiversity hotspot and or conservation efforts tend to be focused on places in Africa or South Asia or Southeast Asia, it's not because other regions of the global north didn't have biodiversity. They did, but they don't have it now because of the earlier stage at which they went through the agricultural and industrial revolutions. Now, those parts of the world that are still deemed to be biodiversity rich continue to be destroyed by global markets and related demands for resources and lands. And of course, by Donald Trump, right? If he wants to buy Greenland and take over Ukraine, it's for their mineral resources. So this is an ongoing thing. It's not something that it's not something from the past. Now, it is important to understand that while the impacts of these activities might be the most visible locally, the drivers are global, and they're located in some of the most innocuous of things. We might say that Kit Kat is a luxury. I'm not going to eat Kit Kat anymore. But you find that the global drivers of destruction are not only in those sorts of commodities, but also in many things that we consider to be very basic, like roads, railway lines, electrical infrastructure of various kinds. And you can look at some of the impacts of those on this slide. Now, if we take a step back and look at all the big problems of the Anthropocene, including biodiversity loss and extinction, it becomes clear that very little of it is linked to ill intentions. Rather, I would argue that the Anthropocene and its socio-ecological crises are the outcomes of societal efforts to improve human well-being, what is now commonly referred to as development. Now, whether agriculture, buildings, trains, dams, these are all activities that seek to improve human life, but at the same time undermine it through unintended negative consequences. Climate change, biodiversity loss, air pollution, development-induced displacement, as you can see in the cases of dams and mines and industries and tourism, they're all the outcomes of good intentions, of the effort to improve human life at the societal level. Now, I would like us to direct attention to the vision of human well-being that lies at the heart of contemporary development efforts, something that I like to call developmentality. Now, it is a vision of a good human life as something that A, is achieved through insulation from the threats posed by nature and the vulnerabilities that are inherent to living as part of nature, including death itself, and B, involve the maximization of a range of capacities that are considered to be uniquely human and beyond our capacities as biological organisms, as animals. So there are two things, right? So when you look at what the vision of human well-being, it is that underlies our collective developmental efforts. It's one thing. One is to insulate ourselves from the vulnerabilities that are inherent to being life on Earth, including death, and B, to exceed our capacities as mere animals, right? So we want to do art, we want to have holidays, we want to have a certain kind of education. So these are all things that are things that are seen as setting ourselves activities that set us apart from other animals. So these are the sort of two broad kind of foundations to the vision of human well-being that underlies developmental efforts. So in some ways, we can argue that the key driver of conservation, of efforts to protect nature in today's world, is development, and of course its predecessor, colonialism. But even more importantly, it is within this larger structure of development that nature protection and conservation take place. So the protection of not human nature is driven, constrained, and shaped by norms and practices of development, right? So conservation takes place within this broader structure, within this broader framework of development. And this structural context within which conservation takes place has some important implications. So first, the protection of nature almost always involves displacement of some kind, right? And the first kind of displacement is that of people, such as in protected areas and places across the world. And this is something that all of you must be familiar with, that you must have come across in whether in the activities of NGOs or in classrooms, right? So this is a map that shows some regions in the Indian subcontinent where there is a lot of conservation-induced displacement of human communities. Conservation also involves displacement of developmental activity. You protect one landscape here, all that happens is that extractive and damaging activity is moved elsewhere because the outputs of such damaging activity continue to be produced and wanted, and sometimes even with greater intensity than it was in the original location. It leads to the displacement of some floral and faunal organisms that are considered undesirable or in competition with the organisms that are the target of protection. And they also lead to the displacement of some individuals of the very same collective of organisms that is being protected. Now, in these last two cases, that is that of the displacement of undesired organisms and individuals from a collective, what basically happens is that the moment you shift the onus of conservation onto non-human organisms, for example, through invasive species control or captive reproduction, it allows for protection of nature to take place without needing to tackle the ultimate drivers of biodiversity loss, right? So, for example, grey squirrels and red squirrels in the UK, red squirrels are threatened mainly because of habitat loss. And the red squirrels that are there in the UK currently are those that were imported from Scandinavia, I think in the 70s, because the original red squirrel population was destroyed because of habitat loss and because they were killed as pests, because they're seen as being in competition with the logging industry. Now, even though red squirrels were brought back, the landscape within which they now find themselves is not really, it's not really conducive for their survival, because they have the ecological niche is much more narrow than that of the grey squirrel. So if you really want the red squirrel to thrive, then it's going to require landscape change. But that is not easy to action. Therefore, gray squirrels become, in some ways, an easy scapegoat, saying that, hey, gray squirrels are taking up all of red squirrel habitat. They're competing with them for food. They're passing on infections to them. So by displacing this sort of burden of conservation onto non-human organisms, whether it's other organisms or, like I said, individuals of the same collective. So captive reproduction, for example, allows for us to address extinction without really having to do anything about the kind of damaging activity that leads to extinction, right? We can all rest assured that there will be pandas for our grandchildren to look at because there are captive reproduction programs. So this is a kind of displacement that happens. And I have here a video. So this is Jwala again from last week. So what I would like us to pay attention to in that video is that even though these are cheetahs that have been kind of in soft release bomas and then released a couple of months ago, they're still, at the end of the day, animals that are biologically scared of human beings. But their need for water is so great that they were approaching that driver like a dog would approach, or a cat. Not even a cat, even a domestic cat wouldn't approach a human being that they didn't know so easily. But Jwala and her cubs did, because they have now been released into a landscape where there isn't enough water for them to drink, right? And this is the same cheetah that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk. So here again, you have the burden of conservation or the protection of nature displaced onto some individuals of the larger collective, which is the cheetah species. Okay, so the first set of implications that we talked about, implications that arise from the fact that conservation is situated within the larger structural context of development, is that of displacement. The second set of implications have to do with renewed persecution, which is that whenever protection is successful, it almost always leads to persecution of the revived organisms. And this often manifests as human-wildlife conflict, which we saw in the case of Arikomban and of many other elephants who are taken into permanent captivity, such as with Chinnathambi in that article. So that was a really upsetting piece to read, because now he was captured from his home region because of a similar sort of issue as with Arikomban, taken away, put into captivity and trained to be a kumki elephant, basically an elephant that is used to capture other wild elephants, and then brought back to his original home region to do kumki work. So that is the kind of, and Arikomban as well as Chinnathambi, they're all products of India's Project Elephant, right? It's a flagship conservation program. And you will find such examples not just in India, so you'll find them everywhere where you want to look. Now, beavers and raptors in the UK, wolves in France, Italy, and Finland as well. Now, beavers, at the end of the day, they're not like wolves or like elephants. But now that there are some beavers found in England, farmers are upset because they change the landscape, they change the way in which water flows, and therefore affect farming activities. Here again, the third set of implications have to do with our response to abundance, right, with already existing flourishing or abundance. And that relates to what you were saying there about preserving something. If conservation does not necessarily always want to preserve what is there, right? While it has the aim of the independent flourishing of non-human life, in reality, non-human abundance that is not engineered or cultivated by human society invites responses of suppression for a range of reasons, from disgust to inconvenience to nuisance to legitimate health and safety risks. animals that do manage to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, you find are more often than not reviled and suppressed as pests, invasive species, vectors of disease, or simply not valuable. And you'll again have examples of that from across the world. So it's not just about preservation, right? It's about preservation of only some kinds of organizations, some kinds of organisms, and typically endangered organisms. Abundance, by contrast, unless it's engineered or cultivated, like in the case of farmed animals, is almost always met with suppression. And this includes regions where there's a lot of support for the conservation of creatures that pose risks or nuisances in other parts of the world. But not at home, as you can see with the fate of badgers in England, who are killed because they're believed to spread tuberculosis to dairy cattle. So that's Prince William, for those of you who don't know, who is a big supporter of wildlife conservation efforts across the world. And those are English badgers. Now, another example that I will discuss in greater detail today is that of free-living or street dogs in India. And here you have, how many of you are able to make sense of this image? What is that the mother dog is teaching her puppies? Yeah. Now, this sort of response to abundance is not only with respect to larger mammals, but also to things like trees, as this list of reasons for cutting down trees compiled by an NGO in Chennai shows. And I'll give you a moment to look at the list of reasons. Done? So why is it that abundance is often met with suppression? Conservationist protection and the revival of vulnerable flora and fauna often takes place in periods and societies that lack the memory, the knowledge, or social norms that enable human cohabitation with non-human organisms. At the same time, due to significant landscape change that involves the spread of development and associated human activity, these organisms, that is non-human organisms, have no choice but to inhabit regions where they must interact with people and developmental artifacts such as fields, houses, hotels, and other kinds of infrastructure. So you have two things. One is we don't know, we've forgotten what it's like to live alongside other beings. And B, we are living in changed landscapes where there is even more proximity than before, and newer kinds of proximity because of the fundamental way in which these habitats and these landscapes have been changed by human activity of certain kinds. So while humans have always lived alongside wildlife, the way in which we live alongside them now has changed, both normatively and materially. Okay, and I'll expand on that a little further with the example of elephant conservation near Yala National Park in Sri Lanka. Anyone here from Sri Lanka? No. Okay. Now, the presence of elephants near Yala National Park has resulted in the sort of social impacts, that is, impacts on the local communities, that are well documented in wider literature from across the world, right? Crop loss, injury, human deaths, psychosocial impacts that come from things like, say, the fear of elephant attacks or protecting crops. Abandonment of fields. There was one farmer who said that it's simply impossible to battle with them, so we're just not going to farm that land anymore. And of course, mental health problems because of the constant fear and hidden transaction costs. So for example, if you're up all night protecting your fields, then you can't really go to work during the day, or you cannot farm during the day, and so there are all kinds of social impacts that are associated with the very presence of elephants there. Now, the usual measures to address such conflict can also be seen here, as with elsewhere, they usually don't work very well. If you look at the kinds of measures that are taken, you'll find that they're all about reinforcing separation between humans and elephants, whether it's driving them back into the park, or putting fencing around the park, or fencing around fields, or even translocating them in some locations. Now, despite this situation, what we found while carrying out interviews with the villagers near the park is that they expressed a sense of discomfort with the kind of measures that were being taken to address conflict, and the kinds of measures that at the end of the day mostly reinforced separation. They talked about how elephants had always belonged there, and much like the tribal communities in Arikomban's home region did. Which then made us ask this question: if elephants and people have always cohabited in this landscape, what has changed? What is it that's leading to this thing called conflict? Now, across Sri Lanka, escalating conversion of land for agricultural, residential, and other commercial purposes has resulted in the steady reduction and fragmentation of elephant habitat across the country. In the region where Yala National Park is located, water irrigation schemes have enabled cultivation several times a year, including during the height of the dry season. Now, the intensification of agriculture and the associated cultivation of lands that were traditionally left fallow restricts the spaces where elephants could previously forage freely and thereby end up exacerbating conflict. So basically, earlier on, there was a spatial and temporal partitioning of resources that was enabled by older agricultural methods, which now have been changed by intensification for very often urban and international markets. Now, these sorts of changes are not peculiar to the region near Yala National Park. Historically, elephants ranged all over the country. In today's Sri Lanka, these animals are restricted mainly to the dry areas of the island and are almost entirely absent from the wet zones, with the exception of small populations in 2 protected areas. Now, any rise in elephant numbers brought about by conservation in Sri Lanka, you can argue, are thus improvements from a state of depletion, as opposed to being actual growth in their populations over time. Elephant habitat continues to shrink across the country, and they continue to be classified as an endangered species. So you have multiple things going on. The overall numbers of elephants are lower, there's landscape change, they continue to be classified as endangered, conservation continues, but at the same time, whatever little elephants that are there, they also come into conflict with human beings, which then leads to all kinds of problems for people and for the animals. So in effect, if you look at what's been happening, the material conditions that enabled elephants to cohabit with people and thrive across the country have changed, as they have in other parts of the world. But even more importantly, the changing valences of human-wildlife conflict, that is how people and societies perceive, understand, and respond to the impacts of negative interactions with other animals, also needs to be taken into account. So it's not just the material changes, but also the normative changes. Now, the different responses to crop loss caused by elephants and losses caused by cattle in the village near Yala National Park are illustrative. Now, the losses caused by elephants are valued differently to the losses caused by cattle, even if the latter might be materially more significant. So basically what happens is that elephants go into fields, they knock down fences, go into the field, they eat a little bit, they move on. And behind them you have whole herds of cattle that come and then they destroy the rest of the field. But despite this, cattle are not perceived in the same terms as elephants are when it comes to impacts on crop harvest, right? The anger about crop losses caused by cattle is not as much as the anger about crop losses caused by elephants. So cattle therefore tend to remain under the radar of public debate and action on human-elephant conflict in that region. Now, if you look at the history of human-elephant interactions across time in Sri Lanka, you find that conflict is not a new phenomenon. What has changed is something else, right? It is the understanding of such conflict. If you look at local art, architecture, and folklore, you find that they bear testament to a long history of both conflict and coexistence between people and elephants. But the changing kind of frameworks within which we live, first colonialism and then development, brought about falls in levels of conflict and coexistence because of habitat degradation and associated displacement of wildlife, right? So first of all, you have fewer numbers of elephants. And along with the fact that there are fewer numbers of elephants, what happens is that the strategies and memories of cohabitation are lost quickly, with the result that protected areas end up acting as very inadequate habitats and landscapes that are transformed by human activity, and animals that cross their spatial boundaries are persecuted for being out of place. So all in all, it's a situation where there is heightened conflict despite fewer elephants because of material and normative changes, right? So conflict has always been there. There are fewer elephants, but there is more conflict because of two sets of changes that have happened over time. So on the whole, the extensive harm to non-human life caused by some human ways of life tend to be addressed in conservation through logics of protection and restoration, but after displacement and endangerment. By contrast, non-human abundance tends to invite suppression and eradication. Now, while these approaches have been able to keep some organisms and habitats alive, they have not been successful in stopping the accelerating erosion of non-human abundance and life experiences, or of intensified habitat loss, something that Rosemary Collard and Jessica Dempsey call the extinction paradox, which is that if you look at from the 70s onwards, the number of legislations across the world that protect non-human organisms have gone up, but the rate at which there is biodiversity loss has also gone up, or rather the Living Planet Index has gone down, right? So you have this situation where we protect more, but we are also simultaneously losing more. And why does this happen? This is because I would argue that conservation, through the logics of protection after displacement, does not interrupt the root causes of ecological destruction, focusing instead on what's happening at much smaller scales, right? Protect elephants in this little corner. Now, if we want a planet that is truly more than human or truly multi-species, and assuming that we want it, I'm not going to assume that, I would argue that we need a fundamental shift in approach. We need perhaps a move from the impetus to protect, engineer, or overproduce, as we do with farmed animals or with some other kinds of valued animals such as pets, either after endangering them or in ways that seriously compromise their life experiences. Instead, perhaps what we need is an ethos that emphasizes relearning to live alongside and share resources and risk with the diversity of organisms that for which Earth is home, regardless of whether they are abundant or endangered. What might this look like? And that is a question that Tracy raised, I think, yesterday. Where do we, if we are already living in a planet where we've forgotten what it is like to live with other organisms, where do we go and find inspiration? Where do we relearn how to do this? To answer this question, I would like to turn to the everyday realities of human interactions with free-living dogs in India to explore this. But before I do that, I'm going to take a moment's break to see how we all are, whether you're awake, whether you have questions, whether you are... Any comments, thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering in the beginning about conservation, whether we have to include learning more about their behavior patterns, their social patterns, because without knowing that, we just see them as objects that are just multiplying or something like that. So I think that's sort of where you were going, and yeah, that kind of ties into the whole idea of learning. Re-education programs, but how does that actually in practice work?
Right, and we're going to definitely touch upon that with this example.
Yeah, I was just thinking, would you just get like a university grant to go over to a region and start educating people? Then that starts to sort of border on like boundaries of civilization, as the person mentioned before, like we are more civilized, so we're going to civilize this region through our knowledge about conservation, and it seems really messy.
I will come back to that a bit later on. Yeah. Tracy?
No, there is thing I really like and think that we're a bit tricky in how the conservation is framed, taking a lot of bad example of what we wouldn't do in terms of translocation or animal dying because of the GPS tags. That in Europe, that's why you have legislation to. They are textbook example we learn in conservation of what not to do. And about the thing that if it doesn't work, when you show the living planet index going down and the legislation going up, there should be also the line of the living planet index going down. Without all this law, it would be also way
far worse. Yeah.
Far worse. So
yeah.
in a way, that's still a progress. It's not just that it's useless. But I very much agree on the dilemma of when it's a thing is endangered, and so we have a conservation action, and then a success results in it being not protected anymore, and then there might be hunting started again. Typically in Europe, now it's the case with the wolf. They have successfully come back. The conservation action have worked tremendously well. They are recognizing, and so it might be that then they become not endangered anymore. And in EU legislation, there is no mechanism to make it as a win somehow. The win will be that hunting would start on them again, and then it's perceived as a loss for all conservationists and like animal rights activists as well. So I really like that.
And they don't have to lose protection for that to happen. So even those like elephants, for example, they continue to be endangered, but very often you have elephants taken into captivity because of, or if a tiger becomes a man-eater, like we were discussing yesterday, they are taken into captivity. They may not be killed, but they'll be taken into captivity, which some could argue is probably worse for them than being killed. Okay, Tracy?
Yeah, so this is a brand new thought. So thank you for inspiring something that I've never thought about before. But it also means that it's untested and may not hold any water whatsoever. But you mentioned the idea that part of the changing kind of narrative of conflict in Sri Lanka with elephants is that there's no memory anymore of kind of what cohabitation looks like.
Which relates to the question on knowledge, yeah.
But I wonder also if there is a changing narrative of expectations of control. That with increasing development and increasing number of people, we have increasing expectations for what we can control in the world. Elephants are extremely difficult to control. Under most circumstances, you might not expect that you could, and therefore if they damage your crop field, well, that's just a thing that happens. But if your expectation of the world is that you can control the temperature of your house to within 1/10 of a degree, and how much water you use in a day, and how much water you draw down from the mountain range that's 1,000 kilometers away, you might also expect that you should be able to control whether or not an elephant has raided your field last night. And the fact that you can't then becomes angry. Is that I don't know if that's
Absolutely, and that's what I was sort of referring to when I said that it's not just material change, but also normative change. And what you're referring to is normative change. So, you know, there are things that we still, risks that we accept as normal in today's world. So, for example, a road traffic accident is seen as a personal tragedy, but not necessarily something that's a societal issue that needs to be addressed by getting rid of all vehicles. You might have like laws to make driving safer, but when a person is killed by a tiger or an elephant, or a wolf for that matter, it's not necessarily it doesn't remain a personal tragedy. It becomes something that's bigger, and that's because of the normative shift. Whereas earlier on, it would have been seen differently. Personal tragedy, but not necessarily something that needs to be addressed at a structural level. So yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Yes.
That's a lovely example of it's my personal bugbear is the number of driving accidents that are accepted in the UK, around the world, by what might be considered a mechanical predator, and it's taken this norm. But we don't have much that's good to say about the USA these days, but there is quite an interesting approach. I've lived in Alaska for quite a while, and there's quite an interesting approach to wilderness, and particularly an increasing number of grizzly brown deer attacks that are fatal. And it is a little bit Wild West in view. That I don't think governance in Alaska has any interest in controlling bears. Obviously they do if they come into the city limits. But actually, the feeling is that if you go into the wilderness, that is the risk you live with. Yes, you can take a rifle or bear spray, or you don't have to take any of these things. It's very ungoverned, and the onus and responsibility is put on the user of the environment that people go for that. And that's quite a refreshing take on it. But of course, Alaska is a big space with not many people. And so I think conflicts around conservation do work a lot in terms of population density, the size and threat of the predator or whatever it is we're talking about, things like that. But I found that approach to the wilderness in that part of the world actually refreshing. And it's not something that anybody would think about trying to control or manage. That's your risk, that's what we do.
True, but there's still, so we live in a planet where there isn't really such wilderness in the sense of like a spatial division between human society and other animals. So whenever I read about the debates around wolves in Scandinavia, I find these numbers being quoted. It's like there are 300 wolves now. I may not have the numbers exactly. It's 300, okay, and there are too many, right? So are 300 wolves really too many? I mean, how do we know that they are too many or too little, right? And that usually happens because of, you arrive at such numbers because of the fact that there isn't the kind of spatial division or the space for wolves to kind of occupy landscapes where there aren't people around. So while that such sort of like wilderness-based conservation might work in a few locations, they can't really work in the rest of the planet.
You're right. It comes down to population density and land use. I mean, wolves are an issue in Denmark because they infringe on cattle, on livestock, right? They're less of an issue in the Arctic because that land use is far less intensive.
Yeah. Let me go there and then come back. Yeah.
I'm just a little bit surprised that you were talking that car crashes are considered norm. I think they are not, because there are whole industries developing more safe and safe cars. There is a lot of hurdles in getting a driver's license that are trying to not let the people who will cause car accidents to not get a driving license. There is police. There is a whole infrastructure around to drive a car that is working against car accidents. And when they happen, yes, it's a personal tragedy, but there is also always a process that is trying to make them not happen. So I think the difference is not that it's the norm and the rule protecting someone is not the norm. I think it's just where the locus of control is, because we perceive cars as something that we can control, and it's like our infrastructure and it's people with whom we can work and who we can change. But the wolf or the bear or the whomever, we cannot change them to not come to the field. So, do you know what I mean?
I do know. I think, so it's more to do with our perception of it, right? So I'm sure there are people in this room, and that includes me, who have lost very close family members to car accidents. And if there are people here who've lost close family members to tigers or lions, it would be quite exceptional and become something that's the subject matter of conversation. Or just look at media reporting on, you might have a small piece on somebody dying in a car crash, but if there's somebody who's dying of a wolf attack or a bear attack or an elephant attack, it's going to be a much larger, bigger piece, right? Or
Someone dies because of a tick. That's not going to be reduced. And it's also a human-animal conflict situation. So
that's an interesting point, yeah. Yes.
I think on that, it's really interesting to see who is the locus of action of that. Because you're right that there's so much investment into minimizing deaths from cars. And a really good example is actually what happens in the Netherlands when many of us
let me, yeah.
So question for you, because here there are so many examples of the bad practice that conservation can lead to, especially in terms of green colonization, where conservation is used as an excuse to violate human rights, basically, or animal rights as well. And so, how do you feel what should be included better in the training of conservationists? Because in certain cases conservation can work and has worked. So, assuming that we need conservationists and conservation, I feel in my training as conservationist, we had zero thing on the history of conservation, on the root of coloniality, on the use of national parks in a very American way to exclude people. Like nothing on that has been taught to us, and we have been mostly taught that extinction are the bad thing, and the best weapon against that is the conservation. But we are not taught at all that conservation could be a weapon used as well against people or other animals. So how do we fix that? What in our training would you say would be the most important to include to avoid these bad effects that you showed us here?
Can we come back to that at the end of the, because it's like a big question. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know. I think you had something connected to this, but also something else. Maybe I just go with something else. So I was thinking, because I've been researching a bit about like multi-species sustainability and the sort of like aspect. Also in relation to education, and someone was pointing out earlier how we can learn about like how like interspecies sustainability is possible and habitation is possible. But then there's also this sort of discourse about learning from these animals, learning from these habitats, from this sort of more than human entities. I don't know if you're going to go then into that later, but I was thinking, do you have any idea how this could be possible, how we can learn from these entities?
From animals.
Yeah, let's put it that way.
Okay, again, let's come back to that. So we have an example which I think will help us work through some of these questions. Okay, right. So I'm going to now shift gears and talk about what cohabitation might look like and what it entails. And like I said, I'm going to do that by using the example of street dogs or free-living dogs in India. Now, this might seem like a peculiar empirical choice to address these questions about wildlife and conservation. So let me explain. Now, underlying my thought experiments on free-living dogs is the concept of unintentional landscapes by Matthew Gandy. Anyone's come across this idea of unintentional landscapes, right? So basically, Matthew Gandy is talking about the fact that like a lot of scholarship and practice on nature, including conservation, tends to focus on organisms that are socially valued, whether aesthetically or ecologically. We might say that something has ecological value, but at the end of the day, that's still a social value because it's society or human beings who are deciding that something has ecological value. So questioning this, Matthew writes about unintentional landscapes. He says the unintentional landscape is not a designed landscape that is allied to particular social or political goals. It's a landscape in spite of itself. And when we say landscape in spite of itself, he's referring to the fact that the very fact that something is identified as a landscape is, again, because it's a human viewer, right? So it's something that we identify as a landscape, not because it's something that we want or something that is serving some purpose or something that we've created that way, but it's a landscape in and of itself. It's unintentional. There's no human intent in it. So unlike protected areas or gardens or parks that are engineered to meet human agendas, and I would include protected areas under them, unintentional landscapes are spontaneous. They are not the product of human design. More often than not, they are in conflict with mainstream human norms, desires, and purposes. So building on this concept, I would like to frame free-living dogs or street dogs as unintentional natures. Now, dogs in some parts of the world, such as the UK and the settlement colonies of North America and Australasia and in some parts of Europe, are restricted to life under human management and ownership. Unknown dogs are classified as stray. But dogs in other parts of the world, including in India, which is where my example is located, have access to life opportunities that are relatively independent of human control and care. These dogs are not strays They are free-living animals that lead autonomous lives alongside people, occupying ecological niches that are created by human lifestyle. So there's like, it's next to each other. Now, free-living dogs or street dogs lead lives that are independent enough of human management that they cannot be classified as domesticated organisms like cows or chickens. In some ways, you can think of them as ordinary natures or unintentional natures. They exist and they also flourish outside of human intentionality. Now, the status of dogs in India contrasts with the status of dogs in other countries. In places like the UK, any dog found wandering outside on the street is considered stray and liable to be killed as unowned. By contrast, dogs in places such as India are allowed to exist outside of human ownership. The idea that dogs belong in public spaces is also reflected in vernacular terms for free-living dogs. Teruna in Tamil, Gali ka kutta in Hindi, Vidi kukka in Telugu, all of which mean street and not stray dog. So while Indian law and public imaginations recognize the legitimacy of free-living dogs, transnational animal welfare, public health, and increasingly wildlife conservation ideas continue to challenge their status as autonomous, free-living animals. So you have norms about public health, nuisance, development. All of these cast free-living dogs as creatures to be controlled through removal or through neutering and vaccination programs to control their population and reduce the incidence of rabies. Now, these sorts of neutering and vaccination programs are also aligned with very particular animal welfare norms that view street dogs or free-living dogs as leading inferior lives. So these programs are seen as a way of preventing the birth of unwanted as pets dogs, and they work alongside rescue and adoption programs which seek to bring the benefits of petdom to street dogs. So you have seemingly opposite norms that work together to manage or to seek to manage free-living dogs in the same way. So even though you might think that they are at opposite ends of the normative spectrum, public health and animal welfare. And in recent years, wildlife conservation has also entered the mix because free-living dogs are seen as a threat to valued wildlife. Now, if you look at the actual lives of street dogs, you find that it gives you a different picture. So for instance, recent research by the Dog Lab in Calcutta shows that far from scrounging around for scraps all day, street dogs spend most of their time relaxing and sleeping. This is not to say that their lives are a bed of roses. They have to search for water, for shelter, for food without guarantee of success. They are subject to accidental and intentional human harms such as road traffic, they being chased away, being killed, deliberate cruelty, some of which can be pretty horrendous. Nonetheless, they lead autonomous lives. They get to pee and poop when they want. They get to choose their own lovers and multi-species friends, play when they want, be solitary when they want to. They have at least some opportunity to escape unwanted or noxious human attentions, unlike pet dogs, which are bound to the confines of human ownership, regardless of its quality. Now, this is not to say that the lives of street dogs are always better than the lives of human-owned dogs, but rather to point out that the reverse is equally not the case. Now, these opportunities for autonomous dog life, however, are under the subject of increasingly loud public debate. So you have a shift that's going on. And this is because free-living dogs, like many other free-living animals, pose risks to people, disease transmission, injury, death, and rabies in particular being at the top of public health agendas because once symptoms set in, it's 100% mortality. So by reframing these animals as unintentional natures, what I would like us to do is to examine a real-world instance of what is implicated in living alongside creatures that are risky, that can pose threats to the health and safety of people and other animals that people value. Now, we can't do that with animals that are already endangered like elephants or tigers or wolves because they are already in a state of depletion. So the cohabitation that you see there, whatever little you see there, is not what one would need in a planet that is more than human, that is multi-species. So we can only work with examples of what is already there, right? And this gives us such an example of cohabitation, which involves a certain amount of risk. So what is it like to cohabit with street dogs? So to do that, I will draw on research that we've been carrying out in different parts of rural and urban India over a fairly long period of time. This slide gives you an overview of the kind of data sets that I will be drawing on in what follows. So just to give you an overview, across the country, what we found through both interview, survey, and observational research is that people-street dog relationships are impossible to classify as solely positive or solely negative. They fall on a spectrum ranging from conflictual to innocuous to caring, with the predominant attitude among people being that street dogs are simply part of the background. People tend to view street dogs as belonging where they are, in the neighborhood. The same goes for dog behaviors. For the most part, they don't do very much, and they are rarely in what the media tends to call packs. Similarly, when you think about actual interaction, so moving away from attitudes to interactions, what happens on the ground? The majority of people's street dog interactions are uneventful. Nothing much happens. Dogs, in observational research, we found that dogs were showing undesired behaviors such as snarling, barking, chasing, or biting only 2% of the time, and friendly behaviors only 20% of the time. But in over 60% of observations, we found that street dogs are recipients of some kind of care or affection from people. People also reported benefiting from street dogs, mostly in relation to companionship and security. So in urban areas, from humans with malicious intent, and in rural areas from other animals, right, like predators. To go into this a little deeper, so this graph reports results from a representative sample survey that we carried out in Chennai, which confirms these trends, as do emerging results from representative sample surveys that we've just recently completed in Jaipur, Coimbatore, and Malappuram district in Kerala. Now, what we find here is that, so we had 8 different attitude questions, which we then combined to form a composite measure, what we call the attitude towards street dog scale. And what we find is that there's a normal distribution, right? So most of the people are in the middle, right? They are neither here nor there. And the number of people who have very pro-dog attitudes or very anti-dog attitudes are at the ends of the spectrum. There are only fewer people in both ends of the spectrum. Now, what is even more interesting than the fact that this is a normal distribution is the nuances in the data. What we found was that a majority agreed or strongly agreed that street dogs were problems, pests, or nuisances. But a majority also believed that they have a right to live in public places, that they belong in Chennai or that city, and that they are pavam. So pavam is a Tamil word that conveys this idea of being vulnerable or innocent. So and this is a word that regularly came up in interviews, which we then used in the survey to see what it would look like in a representative sample. And you find that, so you have both. You have a majority of responses saying that they are pests or nuisances or risks, and a majority of responses also saying that they belong there and that they have a right to live in public spaces. Qualitative interviews revealed a similar mix of attitudes, right? And on the slide, there are some interview quotes. So there are negative attitudes, there are positive attitudes, and there are attitudes of indifference. Like Kanagam says, every street has around 2 or 3 dogs, but I've never really thought about these dogs. In fact, when I first started carrying out this research in 2010, people would kind of be really surprised, saying, oh, why are you coming and asking us questions about street dogs? They thought it was really like peculiar. That has changed a little bit right now with increased media debate and court cases, but it's still, for the most part, that is the situation. You do have exceptions to this, right? So we have some upper SES, that is upper socioeconomic status participants in particular, express the view that dogs don't belong in the city, that is in public spaces, sometimes drawing comparisons between street dogs and street vendors or pavement dwellers. What was also very interesting is that in the Chennai data, the slum rehabilitation group, so people who had been moved from slums to slum rehabilitation buildings, they were the ones who had the most negative attitudes towards dogs, which then has raised this question of whether developmental aspirations, as symbolized by the move from informal settlements to fully constructed buildings, is linked to more sanitized norms of urban life. Many people have relationships of companionship with street dogs. In particular, what we found is that pavement dwellers, waste workers, people from low-income communities talked about very strong, positive relationships. And there are some interview quotes here. So the first is from a pavement dweller, the other is from a woman from a lower socioeconomic background, and I'll give you a moment to look at them. So what we found the most interesting is that if you look at all the public health literature on street dogs, what is very evident is that the poorer you are, the more at risk you are from injuries or disease that is linked to street dogs, including rabies. But at the same time, we found that the most positive sort of stories came from people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, especially those who live and work on the streets. Whether they be pavement dwellers or waste workers or auto drivers, people are out and about a lot of the time. Pavement dwellers and waste workers in particular, they talked about regularly feeding street dogs with leftovers, or in the case of waste workers, sanitation workers, by separating food waste from other waste. So there are some photos here of that happening. So some of the qualitative interviews also revealed a mix of attitudes within the same individual. So the kind of the variations in attitudes that we see, right, positive, negative, indifference, is not only across different people, but also within the same individual. So what we'd often find is that somebody would start off in an interview saying that they hate dogs, they're scared of them. But then at a later point, they will say, oh, but then every day we put out a couple of biscuits for the local dog or whatever is left from the previous day's meal. Or it could be somebody who starts the other way saying, oh, I love dogs and they're the best things ever. But then they're like, oh, I don't want these sick-looking dogs, mangy dogs to be here, or this dog is a real pain chasing all the time. Let's get rid of it, right? So you find that within the same individual as well, you find a mix of attitudes. Another set of interview quotes that illustrates this. So these landscapes of cohabitation do involve conflict, whether bites, barking, chasing, or accidental and intentional human violence towards dogs. So coexistence goes along with conflict. When survey participants were asked to list what they perceived as problems, what we found was that barking was the most common complaint, especially nighttime barking, followed by chasing and biting. Only 15% mentioned rabies as a problem, though it is possible that those who mentioned biting had rabies in mind. And this was quite interesting because if you look at public health agendas, rabies is what is on top. But if you go and ask people, as like we did in an open-ended way, do you think there are problems linked to street dogs? If so, what they are? Instead of asking them if they thought rabies was a problem, this is the sort of order in which they list the problems that they see as being priorities. Now, at the same time, we found that interactions of care were reported by the majority. But these are mostly casual interactions, right? So it's not like you feed the same dog every day, but you're at a roadside food stall, there are a couple of dogs hanging around, you give them a little bit of whatever you're eating. So we provide them with a little water. Now, what is very important to what we've been talking about, and it pertains to this question about knowledge that you raised, right? Which is that what we found was that those who live and work in close proximity to dogs, not only did they have lots of positive relationships, but they had very rich knowledge on how to prevent or deal with conflict. And these included pavement dwellers, sanitation workers, nighttime workers like auto drivers. And this table here has a summary of some of the responses we got on how to avoid conflict, how to prevent, how to avoid being bitten or chased by a dog. And some of it might look funny, like avoid wearing hats, but actually it is true. We've then corroborated it through observational research. There are certain kinds of helmets or hats or carrying certain kinds of bags that seems to trigger chasing or barking. And talking to dogs. Again, we've tried that out, it works. But it needs to be in the right tone, which not everybody can do, but yeah. So you have problems, but we also find that people recognize these animals as vulnerable creatures that have a right to live in the city. And what kind of cuts across these attitudes is the recognition of dogs as creatures that share with people the quality of being jivan, or a life form, of being vulnerable or pavam. So even many of those who profess to disliking street dogs saw them as being pavam. This can be also seen in a general suspicion of dog catching for birth control or for other purposes among the public. So what we found in interviews is that people are often not sure of what will be done to these animals or whether they'll be returned in good health, so they actively can stop organizations, whether they be municipal authorities or NGOs, from catching street dogs. Similarly, what we found is that high-profile events around dogs tend to generate fluctuating responses from the public. In 2007 in Bangalore, for example, public protests asking for tighter street dog control after the mauling and deaths of 2 children soon morphed into protests against the rounding up and extra-legal killing of street dogs. So first 2 children died because they were mauled by street dogs. There were lots of protests. The municipal authorities started to round up and kill street dogs. Then within 2 days, there were protests again, but saying stop doing that. What we also did was to go to one of these communities where the death had happened. And we found, this was 3 years later in 2010, is that community members had not developed any kind of long-term antipathy towards street dogs, even though they very clearly remembered the incident. I remember walking through a narrow gully, and there's this big, scary-looking dog barking at me because I was a stranger, and there were women sitting outside their doors, and they're like, oh, don't worry, he won't do anything, he just barks. Right? And I found that quite surprising because just 3 years ago, there was a child that had been killed there. Now, given the high-profile character of what happened in 2007, the community could have gathered the administrative and political support to eliminate dogs from their area, but they didn't. They were successful in getting a row of meat shops removed as they attributed the mauling of to the dogs fighting over meat waste from the shops, but they had not pursued the option of excluding dogs from their neighborhood. So in effect, what I would like us to take from this is that dogs or any animal might possess qualities that make them noxious or dangerous or annoying, but this does not necessarily preclude cohabitation. Now, these sorts of views articulate not a conscious welcoming of another creature. This is not love. This is not concern for their welfare, but rather an implicit recognition that the cityscape has always been more than human, that has always been multi-species. So this is very different to what you would see in the case of conservation or even animal welfare practice, where it's like a sense of affection, care, desire that leads to wanting to protect something. This is not like that. This is just a recognition that they are already there. So in the words of Chandran, he says, I don't think street dogs are particularly beneficial or problematic. They have been a part of society always. You cannot classify people as beneficial or problematic, same way. Now, this sort of complexity has been captured by research done by others in different parts of India, as some of those references shows. So, in essence, when it comes to everyday people-street dog relationships, it is impossible to describe attitudes as either positive or negative. Rather, they are multidimensional. They are risky, noxious natures, but there is a recognition that they are a part of society, a part of a multi-species public, and as such shouldn't be exterminated simply because they pose threats or inconveniences. But at the same time, this clashes with contemporary ideas of development, urbanity, and a good human life, which rely on dualist concepts of society and nature, that we need to be protected from everything that is not human. So this sort of thing demands the near insulation of people from the risks posed by nature, whether obvious natures such as storms and snakes and tigers, or unintentional natures such as dogs. Now, it is this sort of clash that then produces interventions like neutering programs and occasionally removing and killing. But even more importantly, what I would like us to pay attention to is the relationship between proximity and accommodation and knowledge. So what we've been finding through this research on street dogs is that habitual encounter and proximity that is engendered by sharing living and working spaces goes along with an ethos of accommodation to them as cohabitants. So by proximity here, I'm not just referring to spatial relations, so not just physically proximate, but also temporal relations. So the ethos of tolerance or accommodation that you can see here is not one that emerges from post-materialist values that arise after separation from nature or as responses to violent exploitation or displacement. So it's not like we've endangered these creatures and then we feel bad and then we want to protect them, but rather it is embedded in the long histories of cohabitation in the region and the recognition of the landscape as always already a more than human space or a multi-species space. So this is, like I was saying earlier, is very different to what you might see in conservation or animal welfare, where the desire, impetus to care comes from a certain kind of harm that has already been done. So this is not what is going on here, but rather it's something that comes from both spatial and temporal proximity. So both the accommodation as well as the knowledge that comes from such proximity, the knowledge of how to live, how to deal with risk, how to avoid risk. Okay, so how does any of this help us think through biodiversity conservation and nature in today's world? So one key lesson here is that the intersections between free living dogs, people, health encompass both positive and negative dimensions and a sense that these dogs are a part of society. And I'm re-emphasizing this because this is very different to the polarization that you see in public platforms, whether the media or court cases or policy, around stray dog control and responsible dog ownership. And those debates do not take into account this kind of ground level multidimensionality. So if you're just studying people-street dog relationships by looking at what's happening in public platforms, including scholarship, including research, you'll find that it provides a very different picture to what is happening on the ground on an everyday basis. So if we take seriously the plural and multidimensional character of interrelations between people and dogs, it generates fresh ways of thinking about some of these issues that we are concerned with. So for example, it might be that destroying current modes of people-street dog cohabitation, for example, through adoption or elimination or control of street dog populations, it might adversely affect both human and animal well-being, given that both humans and animals seem to benefit to a certain extent, that is, humans and dogs seem to benefit to a certain extent from living with each other. But more importantly for our purposes, it will also impact existing knowledge levels of how to cohabit safely. And I kind of live across two countries, the UK and India, and I find that I'm always surprised by how many people in the UK expect dogs to be okay at being touched. So they go and want to go and pat a dog like that, right? So there's almost this kind of forgetting of the fact that the dog is another being that may or may not want to be touched in a certain way by a certain person. You're less likely to see that sort of thing happening, especially in lower income groups in India, where there's still this awareness of how to be careful around other beings, whether they be dogs or anything else. So instead of intervening on dogs to manage them, which is what typically happens whether you're concerned about health or conservation or animal welfare, perhaps what there might be value in is to learn from those who live in proximity to dogs, which goes back to your question about knowledge. Do we go somewhere else and teach people to live with animals? I don't know if they're So I'm saying we're coming back to your question, right? Your question was whether, how do we learn or teach people how to live alongside, how to cohabit, right? Do we go somewhere and then share results of research saying that this is what you should be doing in order to cohabit? What I'm suggesting here is that what we need to be doing instead is to learn from those who are already living in proximity, as opposed to the other way around. Instead of getting in experts to teach people how to live with other animals or how to cohabit. So in this particular case, it's pavement dwellers and waste workers who have the richest knowledge on how to live with dogs, not experts, whether me or a public health expert or an animal welfare expert. So how do we draw from these sort of everyday experiences and knowledges on how to strengthen knowledge among others on safe cohabitation? So instead of having an expert going and teaching poor people, how do we learn from those who are already doing it, those who are living and working on the streets with these animals? Just to stick with this case study. So second, the everyday realities of how people cohabit with dogs offers lessons for human cohabitation with a host of other more obvious natures. So like we've been talking about right from the beginning, in the kind of planet that we live in, you can't really keep humans and non-humans in zones of separation and exclusion, right? So we have no choice but to learn to live, if we want the planet to be multi-species. We have no choice to learn to live with other creatures, including urban liminal creatures. And that may well be a prerequisite to learning to live with other more risky creatures, whether they be wolves or elephants or scorpions. Or to put it differently, if the human residents of the urban, and the urban being in some ways the epitome of developmentality in terms of the level of insulation from nature, if the human residents of the urban cannot live with the risks and inconveniences that unintentional natures pose, then how can we expect others, usually socioeconomically marginal rural people, to share life worlds with far more dangerous creatures such as pythons, bears, elephants, tigers, wolves? So how can wolf reintroduction programs in rural Europe expect to be successful if the residents of London are not able to share their fox cities with foxes and pigeons or bedbugs? Third, cohabitation always involves conflict, and we often forget that. Whether with other people or with elephants or with nilgai or with pigeons, friction is inevitable. So this implies that multi-species cohabitation cannot be contingent on positive attitudes and interactions and on relationships of care, benefit, or awe. And this is what a lot of conservation animal welfare practice does, which is to get people to care, whether for endangered animals or for dogs or cows or whatever it might be, right? But if you're really thinking about cohabitation, it cannot rely on that, because any kind of relationship with another always involves friction. And if you're basing the relationship on love and care, it's not going to last for long, because at some point that will break down because of the friction that comes with interacting with someone on a day-to-day basis. And by someone, I don't mean just humans, but other organisms as well. So acknowledging the mutuality of cohabitation and coexistence and conflict implies that all people, especially those that lead often urban, insulated lives, have to learn to live alongside dangerous or unwanted non-human creatures. So in a world where conservation can no longer rely on exclusionary protected areas, all human spaces need to become more than human societies. So obviously this entails risks which are material, but they're also conceptual, they're also normative in the sense of questioning established notions of a good human life. And if we are to do this with an eye to justice, this will, as Paulina said at the beginning, require the redistribution of risk and responsibility. So conservation and cohabitation as not something that is done off by far off human and non-human others, but something that happens much closer home. This in turn will require dismantling development as we know it, and the globalized drive to insulate, to accumulate, and to expand. So any possibilities for life beyond the human, and in some ways for human life itself, I would argue, lies not in conservation or in animal welfare, but in reconfiguring society to enable nature beyond and without conservation. So to wind up, I think all of this ultimately comes back to this question of who does this planet belong to? What sort of world do we want? Right? And by we, I mean the people in this room, people who often tend to occupy public and policy platforms. Do we want a planet composed of only humankind and those entities, whether living or non-living, that are of material, aesthetic, or other kinds of known utility to people? Or do we want Earth to be more than humans, right? So I don't mean more than human, but more than humans and their artifacts, right? And by artifacts, I'm not just talking about tables and buildings, but also cows and tigers and elephants. They all are engineered by humans in today's world. So that is the real question at stake.
All right, we can take more questions, and this time maybe they'll be included in the stream. I was noted that without the microphone, all the lovely discussions and comments in the middle weren't included. So please repeat. I'll bring you the microphone.
Thank you. That was really interesting. This isn't really my field, but I sort of latched on at the end towards the sort of idea of this post-Anthropocene, whereby in the Anthropocene we kind of see things as though we are the main agent in controlling and understanding nature. But in your presentation, it kind of makes me think that we're trying to navigate a sort of post-Anthropocene. Is that how it should be interpreted? I'm not really sure. Do you even know what I'm saying?
I would have to ask you to...
Yeah, because I've been following the Anthropocene sort of discourse, but then in this sense, it feels as though we want to go beyond that towards a discourse where we're sort of aware of what the Anthropocene discourse is the pros and cons of that. And so in some ways, you're saying we need to not just go backwards and think about our sort of cohabitation with nature, but more like develop some sort of hybrid where we're living and learning and sort of moving beyond this sort of limited framework, which is the Anthropocene.
Yes, if you see conservation as also a byproduct of the Anthropocene, not only in terms of the Anthropocene being the driver of conservation, but also as framing conservation, and the Anthropocene being in itself framed by developmentality, then yes. So I would argue that instead of trying to conserve and protect, if you go back to this question of cohabiting not only with animals that are endangered, which then you always want someone else to do, right? I don't think Edinburgh, which is where I live, people would want wolves wandering around Holyrood Park, right? There's a really good zoo, but that precisely, right? There, what happens in a zoo, right? You displace the burden of protection onto other creatures, right? So that's the kind of that is one of the outcomes of conservation being bounded by developmentality, because we want to see wolves and bears, but we don't want to actually we don't want to do what is necessary for them to also lead full lives, to live as they are, to flourish in their own, to have their own telos, to use a philosophical term, even though I'm not a philosopher, to have their own ends outside of human ends. So at the end of the day, any animal in a zoo is a product of human intention. I would say that he or she is a human artifact, right? Because they're there for a particular purpose, for a human purpose, whatever that purpose might be. Whether initially it was recreation, then became education, now it's conservation, right? But they're all human purposes. So when we go back, if you're asking me what I'm talking about is a hybrid, if I, and I might have understood you, I may not have understood you correctly. So, it is true that I am arguing that what we need is not necessarily a return to the past, where, that there were, I don't know what was here in this particular location 500 years ago. Does anyone know?
The sea.
The sea. This is to do with what you were telling me yesterday. Okay, so I'm not saying that we need to have the sea here and fish floating around, but rather, swimming around, sorry, but rather how do we cohabit with whatever can actually live here in the kind of landscape that there is now. But those creatures that can live in the kind of landscape that there is now are usually creatures that we don't want, right? So that is where that's what you mean by hybrid approach, yes, that's what I mean. But it's again living alongside other creatures, but perhaps not the creatures that were there when this area was a different landscape. Even if it hadn't been a watery landscape, it had been a land landscape.
Thank you. I'm hoping for a specific insight here. I was thinking about your comparison of the story of the elephants and the kind of type of conflicts that exist there, the opinions. You didn't get into too much the opinions that people have toward elephants, more the kind of management of them. Whereas when you talk about dogs, what you focused on was the opinions about dogs rather than the management of dogs. And I'm thinking that if you did the same kind of opinion poll about elephants in the places that still have elephants, you would have not the same, but similar patterns of conflictual responses, of deep empathy and respect and love, while at the same time thinking that they're an enormous pain in the ass and maybe that they should go somewhere else sometimes. I suspect that opinions around elephants might be more polarized and less bell-shaped, but regardless, I think that level of complexity is probably similar. So if the level of complexity is similar, then why are the outcomes so much different? What is the precise difference that is the important bit?
Okay, so the Sri Lanka-based research, for example, they're not representative sample surveys, but in-depth interviews with villagers. And I think, so very often it depends on who you're talking to and whether they've lived in that area for a long time. And this is something that you'll find, so there are other people who've been doing more of this research, looking at the attitudes of communities that live alongside valued wild animals, and it's a sort of similar mixed bag where you do see that this thing of acknowledging that they do pose risks, but also there's understanding that they belong there, even if they pose risks. But that's only in the case of people who've lived there for a very long time. Now, what happens in many of these spaces is that there are lots of people who've moved in recent times. In elephant habitat in India, for example, with Arikomban, the first case that I was talking about, that area is now, there are lots of plantations, there's a lot of tourist infrastructure, there are people moving in from urban regions to get away from the city and wanting a more green home. And the demands for relocation more often than not tend to come from those people, as opposed to those who've lived there for generations. Doesn't mean that people who live there for generations don't object or may occasionally want to even kill an elephant. It's not to say that. But this sort of get these elephants out of here tends to come from people who haven't been there for generations. That's one thing. But the second thing that also needs to be taken into account is the material change. So these elephants are now living in habitats that are not conducive for them to live their lives fully because of the landscape change. The contrast with street dogs is that these street dogs are there in landscapes that suit them. They're able to live their lives fully in human-dominated landscapes. So there are only some animals, and I wouldn't say there are very few animals. There are some animals that can live in human-dominated landscapes, other animals that cannot. And that's where you start having different outcomes for both people and for animals. So there are normative issues and there are material issues as well.
Thanks, Kritika, for this fantastic talk. I'm taking risks on the stage. What you're talking about was making me reflect on the different context in which this question of human and more than human cohabitation has been explored quite deeply, which is sustainable food production. This is where my expertise is. And we've had an enormously powerful exclusionary trend towards other species. And we have had increasingly the debate on the need to re-include those species, to re-include diversity, to re-include, what's the word I'm looking for? Not abundance. What is it when you can sacrifice something?
Excess?
Yeah, like planned excess. Yeah, so or resilience or buffer. So traditional food procurement practices had a lot of buffers. You planted the diversity of plants. So if something got eaten by an elephant, you had other areas. You had many different sources, and this possibility for having these material zones of sacrifice, these buffers, this material expression of resilience that maybe you need when you're living in a more cohabitable situation, these have become constrained due to system-wide changes. So land ownership, all sorts of things that we could discuss specifically in the context of food production. So I just think that I think your empirical focus is the thoughts that you've shared with us are so original and they are so powerful because they also come from an empirical context which is under-researched, completely under-researched. So much of these more than human debates that we kind of swim around with, if we're studying this, come from people who have written about their pets, or from people who have written about food production to a certain extent, or these sort of contexts, but these space or conservation. But these spaces that you're studying offer such a powerful kind of empirical example, and therefore a new theoretical opening for how we can think about this differently. Nonetheless, I think there's something, I think there's an interesting comparison to start maybe to be made between the thoughts that you're putting forward and, for example, thinking around sustainable food production as requiring land sharing, spaces of excess, spaces of abundance. There has been some thinking in that area already on what kind of material response we need for a sustainable food system that is, and people here start to say like caring, generous, but taking from your vocabulary, from your conceptual vocabulary, we could just say that is more cohabitable, that is more neutral, that has space, emotional space and physical space for managing conflict, for managing sacrifice, for accommodating these difficulties.
Absolutely. I can just think of two examples from the kinds of contexts that I've been talking about, not the street dogs thing, but elephants. And so one is the work of Jared Margulies on tigers in Gudalur district, where he talks about how livestock predation by tigers has become much more of an issue now because of the change brought about by India's white revolution, the dairy revolution, in terms of the kinds of cattle that are kept for dairy. So they are hybrid varieties, they cost much more to buy, they need much more by way of inputs, whether it's feed or pharmaceuticals or care. And therefore, when one cow is taken by a tiger, it's a much bigger loss than previously, right? And therefore invites much more of a response or a reaction than it did previously when you had a local cow. She would probably give you a couple of liters a day. You'd get milk only some time of the year, a couple of months of the year, as opposed to all the time. So that's one example. Going to Kerala, And elephants, if those, and this is just a thought experiment, if instead of having tea plantations, coffee plantations, if those spaces were opened up for food production, like food that we actually need to eat as opposed to tea or coffee, and I say this as someone who's a tea drinker, but at the end of the day, we don't need tea or coffee, right? Perhaps then the crop raiding wouldn't be as much of an issue because there is much more space. And obviously, then you have those sort of multifunctional food landscapes where you have different things and only some of them get eaten by the elephants, others don't. So yeah, I can see how at the end of the day, it all definitely does link up because I think how we eat is also linked to this thing about developmental norms, right? So yeah.
It has this very pronounced spatial dimension which comes up so much.
Hi. Yes, thanks a lot for this talk. It was quite inspiring. And especially I was thinking about this concept of inconvenience and convenience that you were talking about in the context of cohabitation, because indeed it comes with conflict, and that's why these conflicts can create these inconveniences, and then we would need to deal with those. And there are people who are dealing with them with their own ways, like the stray dogs, street dogs. Then I was thinking, in this world where everything is being done, like all these companies try to make sure that, oh, we don't deal with this, or everything needs to be done in an easy way for us. Like, oh, you don't need to think about this. There's this app for this. You don't need to go all these things because it's been, convenience is a very important value of this world, and it's really like fed by all these like techno-fix also imaginaries and whatnot. So I was really I definitely, it resonates, what you tell, your story very much resonates with me. But I was wondering how much it would really resonate in this world, especially it's not so much from the development context, but what I mean is indeed this more techno-fix context and technologies and what how they are right now framed and sold, and the value of convenience in this context. I was wondering whether there is a real easy future of this kind of attitude.
So you're of this world, I'm also of this world, and I'm as sucked in by these concepts of convenience and choice. So I live in the UK, and if I were to eat only food produced there, then I think I don't know how I would manage, right? But so we're all already, we are shaped significantly, both materially and normatively by these structures. But for some reason, it's still resonating with us. So, so to answer your question, if it can resonate with us, perhaps it can resonate with some others, with others it won't.
Yeah, no, I only wanted to, I guess, make the point that, to me at least, it felt like a rather, kind of a bigger narrative change is needed. It's not only about, how we relate to animals, but actually it's very much reflects how we relate to, how we buy things, how we consume things, and because again, we don't want inconvenience, we just want everything in a fast way and so on and so forth. So all these things, to me, it felt like very much related. And that's why if you want this kind of a cohabitance, which will come with a lot of conflict and inconvenience, then we would also need to rethink, let's say, our, again, consumption patterns and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I wanted to make that kind of a connection.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So reconfiguring how we think about our well-being and how to inhabit the earth, yeah? Yeah.
All right, one final question.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. You spoke about the need to move away from care, move beyond care, and I was just thinking, but if we kind of rethink care more to see it kind of beyond the immediate positive associations to include the so-called darker sides of care, and if we acknowledge that frictions can be a part of care, or negative feelings can also be a part of care in relations. So maybe there is no need, after all, to actually move that much beyond the care. So maybe there could be a possibility to just rethink care as it is. So what do you think?
I mean, so I'm a bit cautious about care because I don't know if it's possible for us to care for beyond a certain limited, for lack of a better word, number. Care very often is contingent on selectivity, whether it's selectivity that comes from a relationship or selectivity that comes from some kind of social norm. And so while it might be that care involves conflict and friction, and it still is okay, but what about the rest of the world where it's not possible? Like I don't care for most of you in this room, so I don't think I care for any of you in this room. So if you really think about care, so then what is the basis of my attitude towards or my relationship with the rest of you? It can't be based on care. I mean, at least the way I understand care, which involves care is also not, it's not just a feeling, it's also a practice, right?
But like in the case of human love relations, it doesn't need to be like full 5 out of 5 to be care. So the attitudes might be even negative or sometimes negative, sometimes positive, but they can still be caring relations. So it doesn't mean that it needs to be super positive to be care.
True. But I think all I was saying was that we can't rely on care as being the foundation for how we engage with the rest of the world. Not to say that care doesn't come into the picture, but it can't be the starting point, or we cannot rely on it. If we want a more than human multi-species planet, and I will always say if, because perhaps we don't, I don't think we can rely on care as being the motivating or the foundation for that.
I think we're going to wrap now. There's plenty of time for us to get back to these discussions over the refreshments. I want to thank Kritika. I want to thank everyone in the audience. I've also been told that this is the record audience for an Eudaimonia event. So thank you all for being here Friday afternoon. Round of applause for everyone.
I'll applaud too. Well, thank you for inviting.